Coming up here on CU at USC, I'll speak with Marvin Wolf. He's a former Vietnam War photographer turned author, and he's written a plethora of books, starting with nonfiction, moving into fiction more recently with some novels. It's an interview you won't want to miss, coming up right here on Trojan Vision. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to CU at USC. I'm Cole Sullivan, and our guest tonight is Marvin Wolf. And Mr. Wolf, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure is mine.
So I wanted to ask you how you got your start. You joined the Army 2 times, you said?
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, I joined right out of high school. I was 17 years old. I didn't have much of a sense of what I wanted to do with my life, but this was 1959, and there was a draft. It was assumed that you'd probably have to do 2 years. I didn't want to wait. I just decided to go in and get it over with. Mm-hmm. There was also the little issue of testosterone. I was 17 years old and bursting with it, so nothing would help except I wanted to be in the infantry. Mm-hmm. So I spent 3 years and 2 months, a little extra time because of the Berlin Wall crisis, and then I got out. And I kicked around for about 3 years. I sold encyclopedias for a couple of years, did pretty well. And then one night I knocked on the door of a chief of police in a town that didn't want people knocking on doors, and I spent the night in jail. And that really got me to thinking, well, what if I had knocked on the door of an axe murderer? Mm-hmm. So that was pretty much the end of my book career, my book selling career. But it was a great experience. I learned that I could talk to anyone. I met all sorts of people, very important people and not important people, and they're all pretty much the same if you talk to them on their terms. Everything's fine. Mm-hmm. Then I worked in a camera store for a while. And then towards the middle of 1964, I began to have a sense of what I wanted to do. I wanted to become a photojournalist. I was then working in a camera store, and I was meeting photographers, and I was spending a lot of time in libraries looking at old copies of Life magazine and Look magazine. So I came up with a ridiculous plan. It was suicidally ridiculous. I decided that I would re-enlist in the Army because I was sure that this is the end of '64. I was sure we were going to be in a shooting war in Vietnam, and I thought this would be a chance to become a combat photographer and make contacts, take a lot of pictures, build a portfolio. So I re-enlisted with this notion that I would somehow be able to talk my way into that job. Well, I did.
How did you manage that?
I have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to thank. At the time that I re-enlisted, this is one of many lucky things that have happened to me. The officer whose job was to swear me in was the same officer 3 years earlier who had attempted to keep me from leaving the Army. He tried to get me to re-enlist. So when I told him why I had re-enlisted, he told me that there was only 2 things he could do for me. He could allow me to take my car to my next duty station instead of just getting a train ticket, he could allow me to pick a duty station I wanted to go to. So I picked Fort Benning, Georgia, where I had previously been stationed, because it was a very big post and it had a lot of people there and also had a combat division. So I got in my car and I drove east. There were no interstate highways in early 1965 except a few hundred miles in the northeast. And the shortest distance, the most direct route from Los Angeles to Columbus, Georgia, was on Highway 80. And one day I found myself in a little town called Selma, Alabama. a town of 5,000 with 10,000 people on the streets. And I didn't know what was going on, so I drove across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and I parked my car, and I got out my 3 cameras, each with a different size film, 1 roll of film each, very professional. And I walked back across the bridge, and I walked around, and I took pictures for a couple of hours. And just about the time that I was out of film, I was accosted by a deputy sheriff who asked me what I was doing, who had sent me, who was I with, because I wasn't wearing these little plastic credential.
Right. No.
Well, I didn't want to say the
badge.
Army sent me, because the Army didn't ask me to come.
Yeah, you just happened to be driving.
So I
through.
told him I was freelance, and he hit me, knocked me down, tore my right ear, threw me in the back of his pickup truck, and drove me out of town. The next day I got to Fort Benning, and I went to 1, 2, 3 different places looking for that photo job, and they all said, no, sorry, we don't have a job like that. Eventually I found myself to the Public Information Office of the 2nd Infantry Division, and again the sergeant there told me, no, sorry. But as I was talking to him, a major came in, just at the periphery of my vision, and he said, who's that? And the sergeant said, oh, this is Private Wolf. He's a photojournalist. And he said, oh, yeah, come with me. He took me back to his office, and he looked at me, and he looked at me. And then he started telling me how hard it was going to be to get me out of the unit, but that he'd try. And I said, did you want to see my portfolio? Which, to tell you the truth, was pathetic. He said, no. 50 years later, when I looked at that film I'd shot, I had it developed, but it was lost. It was misplaced. I realized that he had been in Selma and had seen me.
Really?
I had a picture of him, yeah. He was there. I knew he was in Selma, but I didn't realize he was there when I was there. He was there to find out if there was a Army, what the public relations ramifications would be if the Army escorted the marchers to Montgomery on the famous March to Montgomery. And that's why he was there.
So he was there and happened, you saw him, you took a picture of him, unbeknownst to you.
Well, that was 50 years later when I realized he'd been there. All I knew at the time was he said he'd try to get me out of my infantry company, and he did. And I became his photographer. And frankly, I was teaching myself. And it was on-the-job training, but I was the teacher. Then we went to Vietnam, and I didn't plan this, but I became the indispensable man, the guy he could say, do this. He'd say, you have 3 hours. I need the finest outhouse in Vietnam. Can you do that? Yes, sir. And we built one. That's another long story. But yes, so near the end of my Vietnam tour, I was astonished to find that he'd put me in to become an officer.
Wow.
By this time, I was a sergeant for the 2nd time. And I was one of only 60 American soldiers and Marines who got what we call a direct appointment, or sometimes called a battlefield commission. So then I became a 2nd lieutenant. I served as a number of public affairs jobs. 3 years after I enlisted in the Army, I was the public information officer of the 7th Infantry Division. I had my boss's job in a different division. I got out of the Army in 1974.
So I want to ask you, what was it like taking photos in combat in Vietnam? Because war photography really took off during that period. That was when you started having Life magazine, kind of big spreads with lots of photos from war.
This was the apex of the big picture magazines, which was shortly eclipsed by television. Well, it was a great adventure. I like to say it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I lost some very good friends, people I still think about, still grieve about. But I got to see things and meet people that I could never have imagined. I was John Steinbeck's escort for a week in Vietnam. Who would have thought that?
Yeah, who would have thought?
Who would have thought?
Joined up, they were going to be doing
that. It was amazing. I met the cream of the crop of American photojournalists, and it was a thrilling experience. Did I get shot at? Yes. Did I get hit? Yes. Did I get some colored ribbons? Yes. I don't ever want to do that again, but I'm very glad that I did do it.
And you kind of chalk it up to experience.
I didn't chalk it up to experience. It was experience.
Uh-huh.
It was the meat and potatoes of experience.
Yeah, it was, yeah. So when you're thinking about taking photos in a war zone, what kind of considerations do you have? Obviously your own safety has to be one of them, but what else are you trying to capture when you're taking photos like that?
Action. You're trying to capture action and human emotion.
Yeah.
You want to be as close to the action as you can without getting killed, and that's a very fine line. And some of my friends crossed it, unfortunately. I was very fortunate that when I was wounded, it was a very minimal wound. I got a piece of shrapnel in my hand and another one in my back, and they were both taken out with tweezers. I didn't miss a day's work.
So you kind of you managed to walk the line, stay lucky, if you will. It was
lucky is a big part of it.
Uh-huh.
The other thing as part of it is there's a wonderful detachment, a mental trick that comes with going into combat but not being in combat, being an observer. You erect this invisible shield around yourself and you become, for a moment, bulletproof. Of course you're not bulletproof.
Right.
But
you feel as if you're not actually there, you're observing from almost outside.
And the safety net part of this is, a couple of times I've been out on small unit patrols or in actions with people that I didn't think were qualified. If I had been one of his infantrymen, I had to stay and take my chances. But I got out on the next helicopter. My gut told me this guy was going to get a bunch of people killed.
So another part of Vietnam that's really interesting is that a lot of it, you worked in the public information office, a lot of Vietnam, especially as the war went on, became a public relations battle, if you will. The American public kind of slowly began to turn against the war. What was it like being almost on the other side of that in the public information office for the Army, trying to convince the American people that this was a war worth fighting, if you will?
Well, fortunately, by the time I left Vietnam, which was November of 1966, that hadn't happened yet.
So you kind of almost
the Army,
that.
Our job, and my boss, Charles Silo, was maybe the best guy who ever had that job in the whole Army, and that's not just my opinion. Our job was to tell the Army story, but it was to tell the truth. And if we didn't know the answer to something, say so. And if somebody asked us a question, the answer to which might be embarrassing, we had to tell them the truth, because telling them an embarrassing answer was less embarrassing than lying and getting found out.
Yeah.
Our policy, and my boss was instrumental in getting the Chief of Staff of the United States Army to implement this policy, was maximum disclosure with minimum delay.
Interesting.
And I'm very sad to say that is no longer the policy.
Yeah, it definitely is no longer the policy. And the benefits of that are that you get trust in a way that I feel like you don't when you have delay or when you're not telling the full story.
You get trust, but not only that, if you're the Army and you are speaking as official spokesman, your job is to honor the ethos of the media and give them the information. If they do something wrong with it, that's not on me. That's on them.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have in our first segment. We're going to take a quick commercial break. But when we come back, I want to ask you, Marvin, a little bit about what you've done since you were in the Army, some of the books you've written. That's coming up right here on CU at USC. Stick around. Excellent. That was 12 minutes. It's just
careful in there. There's people everywhere. Make sure to clear each room carefully.
Trojan vision. I mean, we don't have vision on any hostiles yet.
Kate looks chic as always, and it's great to see that she is finally feeling better after her illness that was over the summer.
Yeah, I heard about that. I'm so sad.
Is the stairway clear yet?
Yeah, I'm going up the stairs now.
Make sure to watch out for 2 bogeys above the stairs.
Oh yeah, I see him. Bang, 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 bang. Oh, bogeys are down. Room is clear.
Good work, Johnson. Okay, guys, we're moving in. Oh my God! Oh, there's still bogeys! Oh no! Oh, Ramirez is down! We need backup! Oh no! Oh, the humanity!
Welcome back to See You at USC. If you like what you're seeing here tonight, be sure to connect with us on social media. You can follow us on Twitter at CUATUSC and like our Facebook page. We are just 30 likes away from 1,000 likes. So please go ahead and like our Facebook page. You can also follow me on Twitter at Cole_SULL. And we're back with our guest, Marvin Wolf. And Marvin, I want to ask you, what happened when you got out of the Army?
I got out of the Army. I found a job working as an associate editor of a corporate magazine, an employee magazine for a company, Avco Financial Services. Mm-hmm. And I was there for about a year and a half, and then I moved to another company, similar company, Transamerica, where I was the editor myself. Then I went to work for Northrop for several months, where I was editor-in-chief. I left there on St. Patrick's Day, 1978, and have been self-employed ever since.
And so what did you do when you were self-employed? Did you continue photojournalism at that point?
I continued photojournalism right up until I have a daughter who went to live with my ex-wife when we were divorced, and my daughter came back to me in 1984. And that happened to be right at the time when I went to Japan on a photo assignment. My job was to prepare a audio-visual presentation and a capabilities brochure for an ad agency whose client was a new division of a much bigger Japanese company, and the division was known as Epson.
Okay.
And so I had spent 2 weeks crawling through Japanese computer factories, photographing. When I got out of those factories, when the assignment was over, I had 120 some rolls of film. I did not want to come across the Pacific with raw film, and I also didn't want to take them to a Japanese lab that I didn't know anything about. Fortunately, I knew quite a few, probably half a dozen, Japanese photographers from Vietnam. I had their cards, and we had dinner with 2 of them one night and 2 the next. And they steered me to some of the better labs where I could get my work done. Mm-hmm. So while I was doing that, they were asking me what I was doing, and I told them what I was doing. And they said, "Oh, that's very interesting." And I told them about what I had seen in the factories and the way that the labor force lived in fear. This was a time when the world believed that Japan's labor force, its workers, were privileged. They loved their jobs, they loved their companies, they sang the company song, they had lifetime employment. None of that was true. It was a carefully cultured myth.
So when you found this out, what did you do with that information?
Well, my friends, the Japanese photographers, gave me some people to talk to. When I got back to the States and turned in my work, I had another assignment in New York. When I got there, I went to see a friend of mine who was a newspaper reporter for a little paper called the New York Times. Mm-hmm. He had served with me in Vietnam, and asked him what I might do with this story. And he sent me to a publisher named Martin Gross, who had started a publishing company and wanted to do a book about Japan, but he didn't know what it was. So, without a shred of proof that I was a writer, we had a long conversation, and at the end of that conversation, he sends me back to California with a steamer trunk, and in that steamer trunk are about 3,500 newspaper and magazine clippings that he'd been keeping for years.
Wow.
And he said, go look at all this stuff and write a proposal, a book proposal. And he offered to pay me for the proposal whether he bought the book or not. And I didn't know what a book proposal was, but he told me what it was. He told me how to do it. When I got home, I cleared my living room of all the furniture, and I started taking the paper out of this, each piece of paper out of this trunk. It was not organized in any way, it was just loose.
All thrown in the trunk.
And I would glance at it and say, okay, this is industrial espionage. This is exploitation of labor. This is dumping. And I started putting them in piles. When I finished, I had 12 piles. Those are the chapters in the book.
Interesting. So you managed to kind of divide all the clippings into 12 different segments, if
Yes.
you will.
Then, of course, I had to go interview some of the people whose stories had been in the magazine. Not all of them, but some of them. I went back to Japan. I got a little help from the embassy in finding people to talk to. Mostly, a lot of people didn't want to talk to me. I scored a little coup when I talked to the man who had done the research for a very famous book called Japan's Imperial Conspiracy about the roots of World War II, who was no fan of the monarchy. And then I came back and wrote the book. I finished the first draft. My editor had some comments. He wanted me to pack everything up and take it to New York and sit with him and write the second draft, but I wrote it on a computer. I was one of the first people in the world in 1984 to write 1983 actually, to write it on a computer.
Interesting.
I wound up sending him revised chapters by modem at 300 baud. Do you know how slow that is?
I can imagine.
It's one chapter a night.
Huh.
And it would go to his typesetter by phone,
Uh-huh.
and the typesetter would set the type and then bring it to his house by a bicycle, and then he'd make corrections, little stuff, and they'd fix it, and that's how we did the book, and we got it out in 5 months.
Wow.
I never want to do that again.
Yeah.
And in the process, of course, I lost all my photography clients because I could do nothing
Right.
except work on this book.
And so from then you kept writing more and more books. You were very prolific. You have them all here. What are some of the stories that have stuck with you?
Well, I wrote, my second book was called Fallen Angels. It's a history of LA crime. And one of the stories in there was an unsolved murder, the murder of Thelma Todd in 1936. When I finished it, my writing partner on the book was a deputy district attorney named Catherine Mader, still a good friend. She said, we could solve this. So we did.
Wow.
And we found the last remaining party to the cover-up, a famous movie producer named Hal Roach, who told us the story. The magazine story came out in Los Angeles Magazine. About a week before it came out, one of the magazine editors was a woman named Maureen Orbis, very well-known woman here in Los Angeles, one of the leading figures in women in film, who saw the story before it came out, called me up and said, it seems like you know your way around old Hollywood. Would you like to write my father's memoirs? Well, who's your father? Leonard Goldenson. Leonard Goldenson was the founder of ABC. So I did. I went, spent months in New York. He had me interview 130 some people whose voices are in the book, starting with what was both the most intimidating and easiest interview I did with Barbara Walters. I said, how did you happen to meet Leonard? And she then interviewed herself for 10 minutes. And not 10 minutes, more like a half an hour.
And you just took notes and kept going from
Oh,
there.
I recorded it. Yeah. So that's sort of what launched me, if you will. Solving the murder, it's just one thing leads to another.
How did you solve it? What's the story behind that?
Well, the cover-up was the story. And when you find out who's covering up, then it's easy to figure out who they were covering up for. And the way we solved that is I went into the library here at USC on the other side of the freeway. There is an archive that has the old Los Angeles Herald. And reading through that, I got a sense of who the players were. And then I found some other old publications in that library, and it turns out that the sheriff of Los Angeles owed his job to a Mr. Joe Skank. Joe Skank's brother was the head of MGM. Joe Skank ran 20th Century Fox, and Hal Roach worked for his brother.
So it all kind of interconnected and intertwined together.
So then I had to talk to Hal Roach, and he played footsie with us for 8 months. He was 95 years old at the time, but he was still very sharp. And he told us exactly what happened.
And so I want to ask you just one more question, and that's one thing that you've said kind of throughout the interview here, has been about how luck has played such an important role, whether it was good luck, which seems like you've had a lot of, or maybe bad luck.
Also had bad luck.
Bad luck that one time you knocked on the door of a police chief, you know, way back when. What impact does luck have on people's lives?
I think it has a great deal of impact, but I think what you have to do is recognize that it is luck, that this is an opportunity that's presenting itself, and seize the opportunity. I have always believed that luck is preparation meeting opportunity. If you're ready to seize that, if you're ready to capitalize on it. I mean, I was asked to write a book by a guy in New York I'd met half an hour before. I could have said no. I was making a decent living as a photographer. But I said yes. And it was much more than I'd bargained for, but I did it. The other thing is, if you press yourself, you push yourself beyond what you think your limits are, very often you can go well beyond what you think your limits are.
And those are experiences worth having.
Yes. And the other part of this is writing anything for money. By the way, that's the only way to write something.
It's for money.
It's for money. Is equal parts creativity and elbow grease, or iron pants, as we used to say. Sit down in front of the computer and write. Don't get up until you've written something.
And just kind of power through it.
Power through it if it takes 5 years. I wrote a book with Russell Means called, this is National Native American History Month. The book's right there. It's called Where White Men Fear to Tread. Russell Means is a very difficult subject. He's a very difficult man. But it was a very worthwhile project. It's a wonderful book, if I do say so myself. But other people have said so.
And so kind of having those opportunities, and it seems like you've had so many of them. Thank you so much for coming in. We have all your books laid out here. They're both fiction and nonfiction. Marvin Wolf, thank you so much for being here. And thank you for being here at USC. Good night.
For more of your favorite shows, check us out at trojanvision.com and like us on Facebook.